welcome the master of the ceremony, Kim Dozier.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 3 as we finish with a crescendoing finale. Last night at the award dinner, we honored Kersti Kaljulaid, the former president of Estonia, and Jaroslav Šedovi, a Czech diplomat and former EU official who was very prescient in his predictions of the current Russian aggression we see against Ukraine. Today we continue on 3 main stages here at Maria Theresia and at the Danube and also on the Globesec boat. Of course, we have the side events, and keep using your Globesec app to take part in the dialogue, put in Slido questions, and vote on other people's questions as well. What we can expect today: more presidents, prime ministers, ministers, representatives of industry. We have EC Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. We have French President Macron. And late edition, we have Kosovar Prime Minister Kurti, and I'm looking forward to asking him some pointed questions about the events over the past couple of days. The conference closes at 4 p.m., so we have a good meaty day of topics in store. We have sessions dedicated to sanctions, the Western Balkans, and the European unity, the future of Europe after the war, and the global consequences of the war. On the Maria Theresia stage, we have the EU's capacity to act, security guarantees for Ukraine, and EU energy independence. So let's begin the last day of the Bratislava Forum. I'm going to welcome the next moderator, Shahin Vallée. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to moderate this next session, which is going to talk about Europe's enlargement and its capacity to act. I'm particularly pleased to do that because I think it's a very critical moment. In the last year, 2 very important things have happened. Emmanuel Macron presented a speech in Brussels almost a year ago where he embraced quite forcefully the idea of Europe's enlargement, and in particular the accession of Ukraine. This was, I think, a very significant move from the historical French position vis-à-vis enlargement. And this was followed a few weeks later by a very important speech by Chancellor Scholz in Prague, where he embraced not only enlargement, but also the idea that Europe needed to deepen before it enlarges, which was not an historical German position. I think these 2 important changes, both in France and Germany, are an important testament of how things are changing in Europe and how the reform agenda and the enlargement agenda is progressing. To have this discussion, I'm very happy to welcome on stage 3 European state secretaries. Please allow me to welcome Peter Mišík from Slovakia. Anna Lührmann from Germany. And Laurence Boone from France. So, if you allow, I will let women speak first and ask a question to both of you. First, because you have launched a few months ago, actually in January, a Franco-German working group on EU institutional reform. So I would like to ask Madame Boone to present this working group and its mandate and what you hope from it, and maybe allow Madame Lührmann to follow and tell us a bit more where this group stands, because I understand there has been an informal discussion, which I suppose has to stay confidential, but an informal discussion in the General Affairs Council just a few days ago. So I'd love you two to tell us a bit more where this agenda stands.
Okay, thanks. Good morning to everyone. And first, thanks for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here in Bratislava and also with our new colleague, Peter. Anna and I had decided to, the question one should ask is, why do we want to talk about institutional reforms? I don't think anyone dreams at night about institutional reforms. But there are two things which are super important today. One is the global situation and our neighboring situation and what's happening with the Russian aggressions against Ukraine. And the second thing is the possible enlargement. We have now 8 countries in the waiting room. And the question we were asking ourselves is this union that we have, as it functions today, fit for the purpose of a world which is very unstable and which will have to welcome soon, and the sooner the better, 8 countries? And the answer, I think, is not exactly. Obviously, we've been resilient, but that's not enough. We need to move from being a resilient union to being a global strategic player in a world that is not very peaceful. And so the change in the institutional reform, the question we have to answer is what changes do we need to make sure that we can become this global strategic player? And the idea is not to become a global strategic player just to be powerful, but it is to become one because we believe that our values are at stake. That's the rule of law, that's democracy, that's the legitimacy of democratic institution. And for that, we need to think about how citizens participate better or can participate better to this European life, how we can ensure that the rule of law is respected and strengthened not only on the way to the EU, but experience shows us we need to strengthen it within the EU. We've been resilient, but are we agile enough? Are people seeing the policies that we are implementing or deciding well enough? Are we communicating enough? Are we subject to fake information, misinformation? Yes, we are. So we need to change this as well. So basically, we created this group to think about how we can have better capacity to act, how we can have a better enlargement process, faster, more efficient, not frustrating, how we will have a better governance, how we can enhance European democracy. And if I have forgotten anything, then I think Anna will complete.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Madame Lührmann, this group started in January, and I know a little bit about it because I'm part of it. It gave an interim report and a short presentation, informal presentation, during a dinner of the General Affairs Council. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, indeed. We had a very productive discussion in Brussels just 2 days ago, because now we actually all see that the enlargement is something that we really want, that is a geostrategic necessity that will strengthen security and democracy in the whole of Europe. And we all know that for enlargement, the countries that aspire to become EU members need to do quite a lot of reforms in order to fulfill the Copenhagen criteria. And we also know that one of the Copenhagen criteria is also the absorption capacity of the EU. So I think it's only fair, if the candidate countries have to do their homework, that we also do our homework. And about exactly that, we hope for very inspiring ideas, comments and suggestions from this group of experts. We are having the debate now at a political level as well. We had a debate with all member states on this interim report on Monday, and it became very clear that everyone is very keen on making this process go forward. And I think particularly we really need to think about sort of the making also good use of the what is still called the new enlargement methodology, that actually allows us also to give interim sort of success benefits to aspiring member states. So a bit the more for more approach. How can we actually implement that? And then also, how can we keep the capacity to act of an enlarged EU? I think that's really at the core of it. And here we need to think, I think, a bit about the qualified majority voting, but we also need to think about how we can better protect the rule of law in an enlarged EU.
Thank you. So you mentioned that nobody dreams about institutional reforms, and in many countries it's not really a heated political discussion, but in some it is. I mean, in countries that are hoping of exceeding the EU, these issues are very live political discussions, and in others, and including in Slovakia, this question of what does institutional reform really mean, how does deepening affect individual member states and their sovereignty can be a heated discussion. I understand this is a heated discussion in Slovakia. Mr. Mišík, could you tell us a bit about the nature of this debate? I know this is something that is putting the government in a difficult position, but could you, just describe the situation and why do you think these are so pressing debates here in Slovakia?
So many thanks. Before I'm going to answer your questions, I'd like to thank you to organizers for inviting me to the GlobSec panel, because for me this is the first time. I'd like to address a little bit the issue that has been mentioned here, namely the creation of the German-French expert group, because I think that's very, very useful and very timely. It's timely because we are confronted with a completely new situation when it comes to the aggression of Russia against Ukraine, and so we need to have a European Union that is able to react swiftly and efficiently to the new situation, to the new challenges, and so far we've been pretty successful. We adopted 10th packages of sanctions, and I hope that the 11th package of sanctions will be adopted very soon before the next European Council. Slovakia is interested in these discussions. We'd like to be a very constructive partner in discussions on the institutional reforms, on the ways of the decisions are going to be taken, because we understand that the enlargement will bring new challenges for the European Union as such. I'd like to underline that the enlargement is very high on the agenda of the Slovakia, because size matters. In this new situation, geopolitical situation, the European Union will have to enlarge, because then we will be better prepared to play a role of the important, significant geopolitical player. And it is absolutely in our interest. It is not about charity, it's about the security interests of the European Union. The countries of Western Balkans, Ukraine, Moldova, they are waiting for us. So, with other words, we should stick to our promises. So if they deliver, we will have to deliver, and we should not looking for the pretext, like for example, we are not prepared for the enlargement because there are no absorption capacities by the European Union. And now to your question on the discussion here in Slovakia. So I mentioned that we are ready for discussions. We'd like to take part in the deliberations. We have internal good dialogue discussions in the Ministry of European and Foreign European Affairs. And of course, there is also political debate. Last week, Parliament has touched upon the issue of the QMV. So, and the government, if the decision by the Parliament is adopted, the government will be bound by the decision of the Parliament. So this is reality. Reality is that we are ahead of the elections that should take place on 30th of September. So for the time being, I'm not able to provide you with the clear-cut Slovak position on the institutional reforms, on the QMV, etc. But I'd like to tell you that this is not normal situation. We are not living in usual normal times, because we are confronted with the hybrid warfares, with disinformation campaigns, and that's why we should be very cautious in order not to offer possibilities of those who are not friendly towards the European Union to abuse the situation. With regard to the institutional reforms and ways how the decisions are going to be taken within the European Union, we had a very good discussion with the Professor Costa, Professor Schwarze. I would say that this was a nice meeting between the scientists on one side and the practitioners of the foreign policy on the other side. For us, it was very inspiring because there were some out-of-box ideas. We will have to think about that. And on the other side, for them, it might have been pretty inspiring to listen to the political interests of the member states. So finally, we will have to find some balance between the ideas generated by the scientists and the political practitioners, which are bound by the political framework given by the politicians. But I'm optimistic that we will continue in this dialogue and we will find a good solution.
Thank you. The enlargement question is, of course, at the heart of this agenda. And there is an important European Council coming in December that will discuss the question of enlargement. You've mentioned the new methodology. Potentially we'll have a new methodology after this European Council. How do you see this conversation taking place in the European Council? There is a lot of discussions about ideas such as stage accession or maybe setting a target date. What is the nature of the conversation at this point? Where do you think we can land, or if you don't know yet where we can land, what do you think are the big issues that can be addressed during this European Council in December?
But I think the important conversation to be had this year is about the reform progress in the candidate countries, and this is also what the discussion in fall will be about. There will be, as usual, will be a progress, or it's not called progress report anymore, but a report from the European Commission on where the candidate countries stand, and based on that, further steps will have to be taken. I think it's very important to always do steps together, steps of progress with the candidate countries, but also steps of progress of our internal getting ready for accession, because I totally agree with what you said. We cannot end up in a moment in the end where the candidate countries are ready for accession, but the EU is not. And this is exactly why we need to get ready for this now. And this conversation is basically starting now. I mean, I'm a member of the General Affairs Council now for a year and a half, and I can really see how since a few months, really everyone starts talking about this. There's the Franco-German working group. There is a lot of think tanks in other countries working on this. The Swedish presidency has produced a non-paper with some issues that need to be discussed in the policy field, such as budget, such as agriculture policy, cohesion policy. So just listing basically all the issues that we need to go through. And I think we really need to start this conversation now. And my hope is that by the end of the year, we can actually take some steps already as EU to show that we are able to reform ourselves, that we are able to use the flexibility that the Lisbon Treaty has given us, for example, by using a passerelle clause in order to introduce qualified majority voting in some limited areas, such as the human rights statements and foreign policy, right? Just to show that we're able, step by step, to get ready for an EU that has more member states, and I think that's exactly the conversation that we need now, to use the leverage of the Lisbon Treaty to make sure that we also support the candidate countries as much as we can. We just wrote a letter 2 weeks ago together, Laurence and I, together with our Polish colleague, to the Commission, asking the Commission to really give us an update about how we can, as member states, also better support candidate countries on their way into the EU, how we can make use of the staged accession methodology that is envisioned in this in the enlargement methodology, and also how the Commission can potentially also improve their capacity to actually support the member states. Because in the end, it really has to become true that only the reform pace of the candidate countries, the reform pace of the candidate countries needs to determine the accession pace, and we're not there yet.
That's a very important point you're making. So historically, there was never a date set for accession. Unlike other aspects of European integration, where setting a date, or at least an objective date, was a very important point. I'm thinking about Euro accession, for instance, where that was, a strong push and motivation for internal reforms in many member states. Do you believe that setting a date, and I'm not asking you to name a date, but do you believe that setting a date, potentially at the European Council in December, could be something that would help both galvanize the countries that need to reform to achieve the accession, but also maybe galvanize the internal reform process of the EU that you've mentioned?
So what I think really is that this will be an enlargement like no other for them and for us. And so we have to think about it and organize it like we have not done for the other. And I think that's why this German-French group. It's quite funny, actually, how some say German-French and other Franco-German. But this is why the first deliverable of this group has been to sparkle a discussion. And it was launched in January, and since then people have been wanting to discuss about how we are going to conduct that. And I think it's super important because for everyone, and without betraying any secret, or the vast majority of the countries, the question is not whether we should do the enlargement or when, but the question is how, because we're all convinced it should happen, and as fast as possible. And we have to draw the lessons from the past enlargement, which were too slow, or for what people have been, in some cases, not all, for those who have been waiting. So I think there's obviously it will be merit-based, and there are both internal reform to the EU and external, but I think everyone, since now, probably since it's becoming true this year, is completely mobilized to make it happen. And between now and December, we will have a first informal report on the trio in June. Then we will have a formal report on all accession countries in October. And I think this is time pressure. We have to know how we're going to deal with this between October and December. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be very fast. And in December, I don't know whether we'll give a date, but I think we need to fix a very concrete objective with a set of attached amendments and conditions so that there is a clear path and that is tangible for people, which is why when you mention, stage accession sounds very technocratic, but the idea we have there is it's not like you're going to be in the waiting room for 10 years doing reforms and nothing will happen on the way. That is not possible. I think everyone agrees with this. So we have to find a way where we're all in this together, and every EU citizen and every candidate country citizen sees the benefits of moving together.
Thank you. Historically, Central and Eastern European countries were real champions for further enlargement. Is this still the case today? And do you think there's a strong understanding of what comes with the sort of wave of accession in terms of sacrifices? Potentially tomorrow, countries like Poland, Slovakia, Hungary will become net contributor to the EU budget. Potentially their influence and power will be diluted in a greater EU. Do you have the perception that that people and governments in Central and Eastern Europe are committed to that as much as they say?
Yes, I think that, and I mentioned that for Slovakia, the enlargement is a clear security and economic profit. Mm-hmm. I remember the discussions before the 2004 enlargement. At that time, there were some skeptical countries that wanted us to have a transitional period, and finally, these were the countries that profited much from the enlargement. So we should look at the enlargement also as an opportunity, because finally, so our entrepreneurs will profit from the situation, not speaking about the security reasons I just mentioned in my first intervention. I haven't noticed any negative feelings among the population when it comes to enlargement. I think there is also something like moral obligation towards these countries. I like saying that if you are not able to export stability, so we will import instability. Mm-hmm. So we have to stick to this policy, because through this policy, European Union could survive as a successful project for the next 10, 20, 30 years. If we fail in enlargement, we will lose the credibility, and we will risk the future end of the European Union. Of course, and you are right, there is a need to communicate with the population, because these times are not easy. These are times of the war. These are times of inflation. And population is afraid of its future. That's why we need convincing, very good strategic communication with the population in order to explain to them that it is really in their interest to support enlargement. Of course, we are aware of the fact, and this was mentioned by Anna and by Laurence, that we have to focus also on the necessary reforms when it comes to the functioning of the EU, because the EU will look like completely different after if you are 35. And of course, we will have to look at the institutions, at the budget, at the policies, and this is our internal homework. We will have to do this. I would be a little bit more cautious when it comes to setting the date, because you should set the date if you are completely convinced that you are able to live up to the promises. Otherwise, you generate possible disappointments, and this is something we should avoid. But I expect that we are going to have very intense discussions about the consequences of the enlargement when it comes to the functioning of the institutions, etc. This is our homework. We will have to do it, and I'd like to signal that the Slovakia is ready for being a constructive partner in this discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a question here from Slido that I wanted to ask as well, about examples of EU institutional reform. So there seems to be sort of three camps in describing what EU institutional reform means. There's the camp of people who think we can do everything with the current treaties by using passerelle clause and all the flexibilities of the Lisbon Treaty. There is the camp who believes that we need to have a real and deep treaty reform and use the next European Parliament mandate and next European Commission to do that. And there's a third camp of people who think that we need deep institutional reform, but maybe that can wait for EU accession treaties. So basically do the treaty reforms when the accession takes place. So I don't want to ask you to put yourself in each of these groups, but if you could say, whether you think the next 5 years, the next Commission or the next EU Parliament is really a moment of potential treaty reforms, or whether you think we can do over the next 5 years things without treaty reforms. Laurence?
So I know we have to be kind with the moderator, but I don't think it's the good question. I
can hide behind Slido. It's not only my question.
I think the right question again is, what do we want to achieve? We want this enlarged EU. We know it may not be the same, not the 37 with the same policies. Perhaps some will have more policies, more integrated policies. Perhaps some will use the subsidiarity principle to track back. So there's a first work on policies. Then obviously...
So this is important. So you're saying we could have both more integration for some and maybe less than what we have today?
For example, I think the work we have initiated all together, the 27 countries, is what is the EU of tomorrow? It's not, it's been 70 years, it has changed. It's been now 20 years since the last enlargement, it has changed. So we have to project ourselves into the EU fit for purpose tomorrow. So that means potentially various policies adhesion. It means that will have influence, consequences on the budget. It's true to say that today only 5 out of 27 countries are net contributor. And also it depends on policies, and obviously it will have implication on institutions. So for me, the work that we have to do, the most important work is the substantive work. So it's the policy work, and then the rest comes after to make these policies efficient, because that's also part of convincing people. It's with results we can convince people, because we can repeat 3 times jumping on our chair, it's working. They won't believe us if it doesn't work for them. And what that means is once we've worked that out, yes, if there is a need for treaty change, we should do it, and it will probably be a package. Anyway, we know there will be votes, there will be referendum when the date of the enlargement comes.
Thank you. Want to weigh in?
Well, I agree that institutional reform is not an end in itself. No, it's we need to analyze what kind of institutions we need in order to fulfill the purpose of serving the people of the EU, of an enlarged EU. That's the question. And I think if we ask that question, what kind of institutions, what kind of institutional framework do we need to serve our people in an enlarged EU, then to me, 2 main problems pop up. One is the capacity to act. Obviously, we already now sometimes have the problem that the veto is being used for issues that are not related to the substantive issue that actually is on the table. So we need to reduce that possibility. I think for me that is quite obvious. Of course, while maintaining the idea that the EU is an institution that strives for consensus, and while also ensuring that we have safeguards and ways of including particularly the concerns of those countries that might be skeptical to go towards that route. So that's one way. And the capacity to act also includes discussions about sort of how the Commission works. But here, the Lisbon Treaty already gives a bit of a flexibility, right? Then the second issue that I'm very concerned with is the rule of law, because already now we know that membership in the EU doesn't guarantee automatically that the rule of law is observed as a fundamental value of the EU. And we need to be sure that current and future member states really adhere to those values, not only because it's the fundamental value of the EU, but also for the protection of the EU's budget, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, this is also the idea behind the conditionality directive. So I think we need to think about how we can enhance and improve our mechanisms to protect the rule of law. That is, for me, a critical objective. And then thirdly, of course, we also have long-standing debates about how to enhance the democracy or democratic legitimacy and transparency within the EU, right? There are debates about how to strengthen the European Parliament. And I think that can also help to gain this public support in the EU that you were mentioning in the beginning, to really think about how also that institution that is directly linked to citizens through elections actually can gain a better role also in the EU institutional setting. But that is probably more the long-term debate that might also then require some sort of treaty reform. But again, it's not an end in itself. We first need to ask ourselves, what do we actually need to fulfill our objective and to create an EU that delivers for its people?
Thank you. You've mentioned a few times already QMV, so that seems to be an important part of the package. And Chancellor Scholz, in his Prague speech, which I think interestingly he has not repeated as precisely in his most recent speech, mentioned two areas for QMV. One is foreign policy, and the other was tax. And it seems from the distance that this is the contour of a Franco-German deal, whereby basically France makes a concession on foreign policy and Germany makes a concession on tax. Is that the way we should read the speech, you think? And are there other areas beyond these two that could be part of the discussion for QMV, or you think we should start with these two and maybe see how we progress?
Well, I think it was also the result of an exercise that the Czech presidency has done a few months ago. They have asked in all capitals sort of what areas could you most likely envision to use the passerelle clause in, and those were two that remained sort of with most, not consensus, but with sort of most countries landing in these kind of zone. And we're not talking about sort of doing it overnight. We're having very constructive debates in many forums. We also have a group of the Friends of Qualified Majority Voting in the foreign policy, which is organized by our Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock in the Foreign Affairs Council. And we have already 9 countries joining that group. And what is currently being discussed there are also very concrete ways of how it can also be ensured that if sort of really very core interests are concerned, that there are some safeguards, that there are some flexible mechanisms. So I think these debates can be had. I'm also very, very interested in having a debate about the use of the vetoes during the enlargement process, because I don't know if you're aware, but we have more than 80 steps in the enlargement process that require unanimity. So it's not only the opening of of the process and the closing, but it's really more than 80 steps in between, with all the sort of opening of clusters, closing. It's very technical, right? And these should really be technical steps that are guided by the reports from the Commission, by technical assessments, and should be a bit depoliticized. So I think that's a debate that also needs to be had without...
And presumably this will happen in the run-up to the European Council in December. No, I imagine that some of these issues will be settled in December, or not really?
Well, that's definitely a debate that needs to be had, and okay. This is currently something that's being under consideration, and it's sort of, I also understand that, you know, some people say that, okay, if we need unanimity at the end of an enlargement process to ratification, then it might, maybe that's what you're about to say, then in between it's better also to sort of have that in every step along the way. But I just think we need to really make sure that the enlargement process is credible to all candidate countries, and that there's not some sort of a resignation that you sometimes can feel in countries of the Western Balkans, that there's this resignation that, okay, we have these 80 steps to go, and that gives veto opportunities for individual EU member states 80 or more times. So how can we ever achieve this? This is something that you hear very often. Mm-hmm. So my objective is to make sure that the enlargement process is credible and swift.
I'm happy that you've mentioned this group of friends of QMV for foreign policy, because I was going to ask, but I'm surprised there is not an equivalent group of friends of QMV for tax or for fiscal issues. Is this something we should expect? And I'm looking at you deliberately.
This is something we're working on, yeah. I think, you know, I'm going to be both pragmatic and political. I think on the pragmatic side, and I'm sure Peter will be able to confirm, there are areas which are very political and for which I think we will need unanimity. Because unanimity makes us stronger, and you will hear a lot of non-Franco-German countries arguing for this, and I think it's important for them. Sanctions, the principle of sanctions, we could have decided with, we didn't need unanimity. Okay, but the fact that we have decided those sanctions 10 times with unanimity, that sends a very strong political signal. I think on the enlargement process, first there is this new methodology, but if I'm being practical, usually it's Germany is practical and we are a little more. But this time, if I'm making it, there is this design of this new enlargement method, but it hasn't been proof tested, right? We're going to start seeing that now, and it's also a discussion that we're having, both the votes and how this is working. I think the staging accession is essential, for example, or it's one solution, like our selected access to policies, to give a sense of, to include the countries more closely so that they can see how it works as well. I don't think it's so much about money. We've been giving a lot of money during accession. I think it's about the usage of money, how we can help, how can people really see that. And when it comes to QMV, what we're discussing on foreign affairs at this stage is very modest, right? It's a first step. We're looking at human rights. We're looking at civil missions. We're not looking at tough topics like military stuff. So I think it's also a learning by doing for all of us. And on tax, you'd be surprised, but it's not France who's opposed to talking about QMV at all.
No, I know.
From it. Yeah. But I think, again, this is why when we think about enlargement, when we think about the path ahead of us, and even if we don't give us a date, you know, having as an objective something like 2030 or the next decade so that it's tangible, we will have to think about these things as well. And it may not be always the same for policies. I think ultimately this is going to be very political, grounded, anchored in reforms, but very political. We are making the EU moving from an economic export-driven or internal market, trade-driven actor towards a political one. And it's essential because we're very different from the others from a political standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Do all of these institutional reforms that we are talking about make sense, and will they deliver anything if we continue to live in an EU where the EU budget is ruled by unanimity every 7 years? I mean, do you believe that the minimum we can do insofar as improving the capacity to act is actually to change how the EU runs its budget? And I'm saying that at a time where the needs on this budget are going to be growing tremendously for Ukraine's reconstruction, for the enlargement of the Western Balkans and others, for our climate and energy transition. And it looks like over the last few years we've already done as much as we could to stretch the limits of the EU budget. In particular, I'm thinking of what we've done during COVID with NGEU. But at some point there will be a day of reckoning. We cannot continue to expand the room for maneuver without changing how this beast operates. What is your sense? Do you think EU member states are prepared, and don't want you to comment necessarily on Slovakia, but more broadly, are prepared to have a real discussion? Because it's difficult enough to have an EU budget at 27 member states. Is it possible at all to have an EU budget at 35 member states, each having a veto power on each individual line of expenditure?
That's a very sensitive question, of course. The problem is that then you will have to go into the change of the treaties. And this is a tricky issue, because just to trigger the change of treaty, you need to have a majority in the European Council. And then some countries will have to ratify the changes in the referendums. So, and the answer you will receive to the question that is posed through referendums will be completely different to your intention. So this might be dangerous. But that's why I'd like to say that we should. It's better for us, for the time being, to look for the solutions in the framework of the existing treaties. When it comes to the qualified QMV voting in the CFSP area, I would say that there are some possibilities. Article 31, para 1, para 2, so these are the chances: passerelle clause, constructive abstention, passerelle clause, and the possibility of the emergency brake. So I would look at these chances, because, for example, constructive abstention enable us to trigger the European Peace Facility for Ukraine, because the neutral countries could be on board thanks to the constructive abstention. On budget, well, we should be aware of the fact that the disparities between the regions and the socio-economic convergence will have to be addressed by every budget, because these are the pillars on which the European Union stands. Of course, with regard to MFF, there are discussions whether we need to have 7 years MFF or 50 years. I do not want to go into details, but this will be very, very political answer. For me, as an expert, it's difficult to provide with the answer, because this will be very, very political. Mm-hmm. But of course, it's not easy for us, or for my country, to give up on some issues that are of utmost importance for us. I just flagged this regional disparities, socio-economic convergence. This will be actual issues also for the future. With regard to the unanimity, I do not want to be seen as a friend of, as a member of the group of friends of unanimity. This is not true. But unanimity is principally not a bad thing, especially in the area of the CFSP, because this makes us stronger in the eyes of our third partners. So if we are able to achieve consensus on something, this is really a strong signal towards the third partners that we are even more relevant for others. And if the decisions in sensitive areas are taken by qualified majority, so for sure you will have some member countries that will be disappointed. So this could trigger some divisional, some divisions within the European Union. So we should also take into account that there are pros and cons that should be somehow accommodated in our discussions. Myself, I spent 4 years in the PSC between 2010 and 2014. And we had a long and difficult discussions, but everybody wanted that finally everybody could be on board, that everybody could somehow live with the result that should have been achieved at that time, because we knew that this would make us more cohesive, stronger, and if everybody leaves the room with the feeling, okay, I have to make some concessions, but I understand that others made concessions as well, this was not bad. So that's why I just wanted only to flag, please do not think about unanimity only in the negative sense, because it could be also important for the cohesion of the European Union as such.
Okay, fair enough. Before we open to questions from the room, I think you've all described very well the state of the debate and the conversation. I'm curious to understand a bit more the timeline. So we've mentioned the European Council in December. You've mentioned a few reports that are coming due before that. Could you walk us through, what are the important steps in this discussion? What can we expect between now and the European elections, but also beyond? What is the vision of the next, 5 years of this conversation, according to you? Where are the important things for us to look for, changes or a direction?
Sure. I think this year is really a year where we need to make progress in the enlargement process. We will get the oral update on the trio as General Affairs Council members in June. So that will provide some insights on where they stand. Then we will have another report from the Commission on where they stand in fall. The decisions then at the European Council on this. As I said, I'm hoping that we can use some of the flexibility of the Lisbon Treaty this year already to show also to our citizens that we're capable of reform as EU.
So that even before the European Council in December?
This year, that is still this year,
okay.
The European Council, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And then I expect actually the campaign for the European Parliament election next year to be very much a campaign also about the future of the EU and the question of how we prepare the EU for this enlargement process. Enlargement will be a big part of that campaign, and also ideas about how to deal with it, how to prepare the EU for it. That should be at the heart of the campaign. And then the next institutional term of the next Commission and the European Parliament should then be the term to make us ready sort of more in the midterm for enlargement.
Okay.
Yeah.
Meaning first wave or first country to join the EU only after that next European Parliament or next European Commission? I'm trying to push you into some sense of a date.
No, and you know that you're not going to get that, but because it honestly really depends on the progress of the candidate countries. And as I said, we're working very hard to make sure that this sentence, it depends on the progress in the candidate countries, really is true.
Okay.
And for that, we still have 3 obstacles. We have the obstacle of the absorption capacity that we need to work on. We have the obstacle of the public support in EU member states that we really need to work on, because I don't think our publics have yet understood that we're working on creating an EU that has more than 30 members. We really need to have that conversation so that in the end we can ensure public support also. And then thirdly, we still need to improve our support as Commission and as member states for the candidate countries. I think we can still do more to support them on their reform path. So these are 3 things that we really need to do.
Thank you. We have a couple minutes for questions. So yes, please, go ahead. Please stand up and introduce yourself briefly.
So I'm Rika Josviak, I'm the Europe editor of Radio Free Europe. I have a question for Madame Boone, because my mathematics doesn't really add up. You talk about 8 countries, potential and candidate countries, and we talk about EU 35 as well. But as far as I know, there are 10 countries that want to join. 6 in the Western Balkans, you have Turkey, Moldova, Georgia and Ukraine. So which 2 do not fit in your enlarged Europe or EU?
So you caught me on the math, but you didn't caught me. You didn't catch me on politics. There are many countries, if in an active way looking for enlargement, and we will have the report on enlargement. So, I mean, as Anna was saying, it takes two to tango, right? It takes the EU to actually welcome the countries, and it takes the country to actually desiring to get into the EU. And in some instances, it's because public opinion has faded. And on this, we need to work very clearly. In some instances, it's the government and not the public opinion. And I think, you're touching upon something that's really, really crucial. We are running the risk of losing some countries, that they drift away from us and they move to Russia or they move to China. And when we talk about being a strong geopolitical actor, it's also about this. I think it doesn't happen often, but if there's one thing, beyond Ukraine, on which everyone agrees, is we need to be together, stronger, with all the waiting countries to make sure that the continent will be a beacon of stability, security, democracy, and social market economy, green economy. I could continue like that, but to keep our model. It's that, or we will slowly be undermined by all the propaganda, the misinformation, the disinformation that is trying to destabilize the region around.
Thank you. I think this draws our panel to a close. This conversation on EU enlargement, institutional reform, in fact, continues. After the coffee break at 10:15, I will invite you to join the live streaming from Danube stage, but that will be also live streamed here of the interview with the Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen. And I'm pretty sure that this will also be part of the speech of President Emmanuel Macron later on today. I have no privileged information. I'm just guessing that this will be part of the discussion. So I think this conversation is ongoing and will stay with us for the next few weeks, months, and years. And thank you very much to all the panelists for having enlightened us on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you.